welcome to the continuation of our ICLS 20th anniversary, 21st century anniversary celebration. Last night we had the pleasure of hearing the reflections and reminiscences of the four former and current directors of ICLS. Today, as Anu explained, we're going to be hearing from alums and current PhD students, and then later in the day we'll have breakout sessions co-chaired by current doctoral students and some of our majors. The question came up yesterday whether 20 years is a long time or a short time. I guess one way in which that can be measured is the fact that many of our graduates have gone on to have important careers of their own, have become scholars, teachers, colleagues at other universities. So it's really wonderful to welcome a number of those former students back today. I was talking with Status and Anu about the fact that we also have at least one ICLS couple with children, so there is another generation. I think Anu explained very well the format of this afternoon, so I won't go over that again. But the first panel will be on pedagogies. And so I think we can pick up from what Status Waggoner said yesterday about ICLS being a place of theory, but also a place of practice, not least a place of pedagogical practice, a place where we learn, where knowledge is produced, created through teaching. It's been always a great pleasure for me to teach undergraduates and graduate students at ICLS, and I feel that I have learned and probably also unlearned a lot in that process. So I'm very actually moved to be part of today's event. So I know that the talks will touch on many things, including the relationship between pedagogy and theory, many of the challenges that came up yesterday in the directors' talks, so the institutional obstacles and resistances, the growing corporatization of the university, and particularly the growing inequalities in access to higher education, both locally, nationally, and globally. So we look forward to those comments. So I think without further ado, I will introduce the first pairing of speakers. First, our first alum, who is Ben Baer, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton University. So Ben is a true comparatist who thinks across regions and across languages. He works on pockets of South Asia, Europe, Caribbean, and Africa in Bengali, French, German, and English. Ben is a translator. He has translated from the Bengali one of modern India's landmark experimental novels. I'm going to screw this up. Hansuli Banko Akatha. The Tale of Hansuli Turn, which warns about persistent production of subalternity in decolonization and resonates with Feynman, among other thinkers. Ben's current book is the forthcoming Indigenous Vanguards, Education, National Liberation, and the Limits of Modernism, which is coming out of Columbia very soon. And his remarks are going to be titled Educating Educators. And then after Ben speaks, responding will be Nada Khalifa, who is a PhD candidate in history and ICLS, who works on Arabic intellectual history of the late 19th and early 20th century. Please join me in welcoming them.
Is the mic okay?
Yep.
All right. A huge thank you to all the organisers and to Nada Khalifa, my respondent. I'm extremely grateful to have been invited to participate today. It bears repeating. Happy birthday, ICLS. Many happy returns. Okay, we're going to rock it old school. I'm proud and privileged to be an alumnus of this amazing experiment. I was among the first groups of graduate students to emerge through comparative literature in society. Back then it was not an institute, but the Centre for Comparative Literature in Society. I began in 1999, right after CCLS was founded, and I received my doctorate in 2006. For today's event, we were asked to reflect on what has changed in the conditions for practicing the unusual kind of work that comparative literature and society called for when we were students. Well, the world has changed. The world has changed in 20 years, and I can't digest the new divisions, polarities, inequalities, and violences of all this turbulence in 8 minutes. Okay, I have slides as well, okay. A shorthand index of change may be discerned in the images you see on the screen now. I told you it was old school. On the left, you see the Centre's homepage in 1999. On the right is the Institute's homepage today. For me, one of the hooks was and remains "and society." The sense that perhaps here a real dialogue between the humanities and the social sciences could begin. So in 1999, CCLS was a kind of funky homegrown experiment in doing this interdisciplinary work on literature and its social context from a global perspective, rubbing against the institutional grain, as Stathis put it yesterday. And then not just social science as material for fleshing out social context, but as the rare chance to question such a figure and ground distinction, such a subject and object relation. This was before interdisciplinarity had become a byword for unregulated academic entrepreneurialism, as every major university sought aggressively to globalize itself at any cost. Changes. This is an institute that must necessarily remain legible within an increasingly corporatized university. The university's change to globalizing powerhouse of knowledge production was already discernible in the late 90s. So what I'm saying here is not to criticize the fact that ICLS now has a website that reflects this in certain ways. All such entities need these resources. They have become an indispensable element of the infrastructure of contemporary education. Change slide. But what these sites and images record can also be a preliminary sign of the changes in the conditions and in the form and content of, I quote, theoretical work, comparative, multilingual, transregional, or interdisciplinary research today, to quote from the prompt that I was sent by the organisers. As Andreas put it yesterday, social media are a part of the changes and conditions. They disclose new incompatibilities that condition our work through the very mediatised interconnections they represent. So good, let's blog otherwise. I'm profoundly disheartened by current calls within the humanities to redisciplinarize and get back to the supposedly real work of cultivating specialist knowledge within epistemological silos. Comparative literature and society has the means to push back against this shift. New slide. CCLS, I know you probably can't read all that. CCLS set up stricter than usual terms for learning and doing interdisciplinarity. Its sustaining presupposition for interdisciplinary training has been that it is like a language requirement. Take courses in another disciplinary area such that you can, as far as possible, speak its language and grasp how it constructs its objects of knowledge differently, so that we can talk with rather than at each other and perhaps avoid opportunism and facile analogization. As you can see from the slide, the formula has changed a little between then and now, but it remains. These are some of the conditions of doing theoretical work, and the results will be in the doing, okay, the practice. I must address myself to you in your language. Je dois m'adresser à vous en votre langue. Some of you might recognize that quote. One may imagine this as a watchword for the conditions of theoretical work and interdisciplinarity, a watchword that has become more important over the changing years. Conditions of doing theoretical work, okay? Not just in the sense of a circumstance or context, but in the stronger sense of an imperative. Theoretical, interdisciplinary, transnational work on these conditions. New slide. This is the homepage from 2006, now standardized into the then prevailing Columbia House style. By 2006, when I graduated, CCLS had also explicitly positioned itself as a site from which to rethink area studies paradigms in recognition that the baby of in-depth language learning and regional study should not be thrown out with the bathwater of residual Cold War knowledge production. More years, more changes. The Centre became the Institute in 2007. Some familiar faces there. If I may presume to speak for many of the graduate alumni of Comparative Literature and Society, the biggest change for any of us undertaking theoretical work, etc., is from student to teacher, inserted into a different formal structure of responsibility. One of the ways in which the conditions for theory, interdisciplinarity, and so on can change is in the people who produce it, and the people who teach it to others, others who may then go on to teach. I have to say that I'm extremely embarrassed to show a picture of myself in class here. The artist Rainer Ganal used to come and document various intellectual events. And this is the introduction to Comparative Literature and Society, fall 1999, taught by Gayatri Spivak and Hamid Dabashi. There they are at the top of the screen. I believe that this was the first team-taught class. Now, these kinds of images have now become an integral part of university self-promotion. Back then, they were weird and unusual. But my point is that theory, transnational work, interdisciplinarity doesn't exist in a void. It needs to be done by people. One of the ways the conditions for such work undergo change is in the people who produce it, the ones who are trained in a place like this. We must ask, then, who is produced to become the agent of theory production, and how? Among all these changes, there remains the silent tenacity of those language requirements, in the expanded sense that I've discussed. As someone who's directed both an undergraduate and a graduate program in my own department, I'm painfully aware of the fact that formal language requirements are no guarantee that they will be followed through. But without the languages for global study, we are deprived of the moklos, the lever with which to enter the text, the cultural or the social script, and to find within it its own delicate and otherwise illegible resources for change. To delve into the epistemic for epistemological transformation, where languaging is the ground and preparation for interdisciplinarity and transnational thinking. And while Marx famously wrote in his third thesis on Feuerbach of the paradox that the educators themselves must be educated, he also wrote there of a Selbstveränderung, right? A self-change. So that the kind of work I'm talking about, the promise and gift of Centre and Institute, 5 seconds, is necessarily open-ended because it should always entail self-change. The chance to change our own epistemological constructions rather than only stockpile knowledge about the other. A scary and exciting position, but good scary. And not at all easy to do. But without this, there is little comparativism, fewer imaginable other worlds, and certainly no and society for us to consider. I'm deeply grateful that ICLS sustains this gift of possibility. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for your presentation, and especially for the kind of time machine into the past. That was wonderful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just take up what I think are the 3 sort of points that came up for me, and just try to expand a little and maybe pose some questions of my own. So the first thing I took away was this point about kind of transitions and shifts from 1999 to today, which was indexing using this kind of very striking visual example. Maybe this is putting it a bit too strongly, but it struck me that your tone was maybe a bit ambivalent, or there was some sort of lament in it for like a sense that something has been lost even though something else has been kind of preserved. And I was trying to get a handle on what this lost kind of element might be. You suggest that what used to be the purview of a handful of students interested in kind of situating literature in a social context, you're saying, well, that has now had to sort of give in to kind of imperative around branding, repackaging, streamlining. and this in the context of the rise of an unregulated academic entrepreneurialism. You read the stylish graphics as a veiled injunction of sorts. The promised dialogue between the humanities and social sciences not only has to take place, but it has to take place in such a way or on certain terms. And I've just completed a grant application which I was called upon to explain in 1,400 characters or less how approaches, concepts, and debates from other disciplines inform my research, so I can very much relate to this odd kind of injunction. This is something I feel we always have to contend with as people whose projects don't necessarily fit into old-style disciplinary rubrics, this kind of demand for packageable research. How do we appease that without compromising our own kind of intellectual commitments and seriousness? How to experience this kind of demand as a blessing and a challenge rather than a kind of call for watered down gestures toward a unity of the sciences that doesn't actually exist in practice. And what I think is important about what you've said is there is this kind of emphasis on regulation. The fact that there is a demand for whatever global interdisciplinary doesn't mean that we sacrifice rigor and method. It's rather a matter of transforming that injunction into an occasion for production, for the production of something new. And it's really on us to defend interdisciplinarity as a kind of epistemic virtue in its own right, rather than just a sort of weak synonym for cutting edge or relevant or theoretical or whatever. So that was the first point that struck me in what you said. Secondly, I guess is the question you raise about the relationship between comparative work and area studies. And as you mentioned, ICLS's mandate from the very start kind of challenged this post-Cold War regionalization paradigm. And in your faculty bio, you state flatly, I am a comparatist, not an area expert. And so I'm curious about what that distinction means for you. You're suggesting there's a kind of specificity to doing comparative work. There are certain kinds of phenomena, both historical, social, literary, that can't be understood adequately without comparison, or rather that there are certain kinds of phenomena that call for an expansive understanding of context, because they don't sort of a priori limit themselves either regionally or to a particular sort of bounded social field. But I also think that we need to acknowledge that this kind of aspiration to comparativity poses some important challenges, one very much related to professionalization, but the other related to the theorization of our objects. So for one thing, there's the question of, okay, so how much knowledge do you need, let's say, to have about a particular place in order to write about it? How much do I need to know about Bengal if I want to write about Bengali intellectuals? Or is this more a matter of kind of letting our texts and interlocutors define our horizons for us, rather than kind of worrying too much about missing something out of ignorance? And this is my own kind of anxiety as a historian, where we are, there's perhaps an unusual demand for sort of comprehensiveness and knowing about the whole sort of field you're in before entering it. And the second problem, which is the one related to professionalization, is a question about audience, right? So can we assume that we have one when, for the most part, academics still kind of make their decisions about what interests them and what they can comment on from a position of being sort of grounded in a particular area study or in a particular sort of place, right? How do you negotiate that when certain aspects of your work don't always align with the kind of mainstream of the field you're in, and so on. And okay, my last point is this question of pedagogy that you raise, which I assume is sort of coming out of your own research on intellectual vanguardism and the philosophy of education. So how to educate the educators? ICLS's answer seems to have been, well, by making them learn a lot of languages. And so this is the aspect of the Institute's mandate that we seem to really identify with and claim as our disciplinary identity. So I'm wondering what we can sort of make of this point, how sort of language training is coextensive with an openness to self-transformation, but how do we conceive that not just in terms of the conventional way of saying, oh, this is this is a way, language study is a way of entering into the idiom of a different culture or different tradition or something like that. And I think the philosophy of education is a particularly productive site for thinking through this problem, that is to say how we can kind of conceive of the value of multilinguistic training beyond this kind of stupid idiom of, you know, intercultural dialogue or something like that. It's a particularly productive site for thinking through that, because it's sort of assuming this background of virtualities, right? Like it's assuming that students and teachers are sort of moldable people who aren't necessarily contained within the logics of a particular cultural order, a particular sort of civilizational order. And I was wondering if you could, I suppose, just expand on that sort of allusion you made to Marx and to philosophy of education. So what can our sort of multilinguistic, let's say, training, where can that take us beyond just, you know, we know about lots of different places. Or thank you. That's all I have to say.
So we'll hold any responses from Ben until we finish all the presentations. So thank you, Ben and Nada. The next alum presenter will be Jason Chaudhary, who is the Executive Director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and a core faculty member specializing in social and political theory. And his research focuses on Frankfurt School critical theory, political economy, media, religion, and post-colonial studies. He has published in a wide range of publications and venues, including The Guardian, LARB, Quartz, Social Text, Dialectical Anthropology, Jewish Daily Forward, and Three Quarks Daily. Ajay is currently working on a book of political theory for the Anthropocene. And his remarks will be titled The New Scholasticism, Coming to Terms with the 20th Century University and Its Critical Others. And responding will be Amaya Tripathi, who is a graduate student in English and ICLS, who works on documentary across media in the 1930s, specifically focusing on how intellectuals aim to reach wider international working class publics during the Spanish Civil War. And Amaya reported for the Daily Beast on Colombia's recent referendum.
Cool. Can I do it from here?
I think it's easier.
Yeah, it's going to be way easier. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you to Sarah and Anna Valise and everyone else who was involved in organizing this. This is my second time coming back to speak at one of these ICLS events, and it's really interesting. The last time I sort of gave a long spiel on, specifically on pedagogy. This time I sort of bit off the piece that was more research oriented, so we'll see how that goes. And I'm glad the specter of branding has already been, specter of branding and sort of broader social context has already been raised. I guess I'm here representing a critical other. I run and teach at an organization called the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. I'm more than happy to talk about our work elsewhere, but predominantly we do public critical education and research in the public sphere. We have 1,500 students annually here in New York and several hundred more scattered throughout the country, and we do national programs with labor, political organizations, and other social movement spaces. And why do I mention all this? Because one of the things I want to be talking about is, in fact, where we're producing knowledge and why. I will sort of throw this out there, and I'll come back to it at the end. You have probably read, we have about 50 affiliated faculty. I bet you have read their work and you don't even realize it, because we try to put work in a place where people will actually see it. Okay, anyway, that's my thank yous. The other thing I'll preface this with saying is, and I say this every time I'm at a place like Columbia, particularly Columbia, I believe Lee Bollinger, right? He's still this is being recorded, right? All right. Lee Bollinger is still the highest paid private university president in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, which probably means the highest in the world. And, we have to think about this institution. I wrote like a proper paper. I'm just going to talk about the paper, or else I'll go so far over time, it'll be fucking hilarious. But, when we think about the kind of conversation we're having, we have to think about what this institution does. It makes nice liberal grunts, but it does nice things like that. But the truth is, right now, and I know there are students here who are involved in this organization effort, but right now, the administration of this university is more than happy to take advantage of right-wing government with the ever so slight shift in the NLRB composition to try to quash what remains of the incredibly decimated American labor movement, particularly in the post-Janus decision context. So we really need to be thinking about what are universities, especially like this one, for, including their constituent parts, which is us. I am a proud ICLS and CCLS is when I started, alumnus, and sitting here, I serve a social function as well. So I want to think about what that is. So, and the other thing I should mention here, I'll leave out a bunch of things, is that I'm particularly interested in the left. I'm going to be very open about that. I don't think all scholarship is leftist. I don't think all scholarship should be explicitly teleologically oriented towards politics, but I am explicitly interested in how one produces and where one produces and why emancipatory knowledge, and what gets classified as emancipatory left-wing knowledge. So a couple of things. One, there's an internal political economy to research production within R1 university, particularly elite private R1 universities, well beyond old adages such as publish or perish. There is a set of, to use the economic vernacular, perverse incentives that are particularly observable when thinking about left-wing intellectual work. But these are also broadly applicable. The primary incentive in existing university structures for graduate students and faculty is the reproduction for the need for faculty in the first place. How to justify programs, how to mint new PhDs, compete for scarce publication space, scarce institutional resources that are being directed towards development, things like that. My intention is not to dismiss these questions, but rather to highlight their fundamental role in guiding and shaping research. They're institutionally rational. In the humanities and social sciences, this manifests as the need to produce new terms, adopt new frameworks, or otherwise attend to a series of questions that arise not from the research question itself, which I'll talk about in a moment, nor from a series of inquiries arising out of social desire or social necessity, but specifically attending to a defensive case for the existence of research in the first place. This incentive diminishes over time in direct proportion to security, which activates a different set of incentives. It's really a nice closed circuit. In the natural sciences, which should also be part of the story, those are very similar but distinct, ever so slightly distinct phenomena, in which the above applies, but also as the additional incentive of intensive focus and intensive incentivization for creating profitable revenue streams, right? Chemical patents, analytic processes for, I lost it, analytical processes for commercial application, new technologies, and so on, as well as an emphasis on sheer quantity, right? This is my friends who work in the natural sciences and the more quantitative social sciences complain about this endlessly, right? It's just like, I'm going to repackage this paper 605 times. I'm going to skip about the sort of composition of the university. I have a lot of stats and things, I don't want to share that, but like basically when we talk about a place like this, we're talking about like a 0.4% of the American university landscape. So there is this hilarious thing which happens, which people will like look at, especially teaching, or like things that happen in classrooms at a place like Columbia and be like, that's the American social world. That's not the American social world. However, there is an interesting inverse relationship with research agendas. Actually, what goes on Ivy League, Stanford, Chicago, et cetera, in these very elite R1 spaces does dominate a lot of the research agenda. The second thing I want to flag here is this thing I'm going to be calling scholasticism. A, I don't hate it. But B, I don't want this to be mistaken as like that so-called style bullshit. Really? Already? I'm timing myself. Okay. It's not so-called, so-called culture wars. There's this grief and studies nonsense that people are complaining about. That's actually the good stuff. My premise is actually that, the idea that the university is like a hotbed of leftist indoctrination is like, it's a joke. It doesn't actually happen. So since I'm running out of time, I'll sort of cut to the chase. Won't give you the history. You guys know that. So I've addressed at length elsewhere the changing nature of governance in 21st century society. I'm happy to talk about this maybe in the Q&A. How to understand the university as a key site on a network of informal neoliberal governance. This is not necessarily about knowledge production. This is about the function in society. With the continued diminishment of popular sovereignty. What concerns us, though, is a way in which, even apart from this, faculty research is far from one of the raison d'etre of the contemporary elite university, but rather it fulfills externally one of two functions. And I've talked about the revenue stream one. The second one is, of course, a branding function. This branding function intensifies the existing incentive structure. Catherine Liu had a wonderful piece about this recently. Scholars can demonstrate that literal star power. And this, again, incentivizes the maintenance and the building of academic brands, right, internal to the university, of ascendant frameworks and turns, right? Again, and this is further and further apart from the needs of any social base. And the social base of the university is changing. Wow, already running out of time. The connections, I'll just jump right ahead. The connections to parties, social movements from where left intellectuals have previously been located did not vanish together or overnight, nor did the shift I'm discussing sort of should be mistaken for like nostalgia for traditional parties over like so-called new social movements and things like that, but rather what is being incentivized and how can we align these things, and my argument is that we can't. There are okay. So this is what I call the new scholasticism. Several caveats. I do not mean scholasticism as a reproach. I mean it formally, right? This is self-referential work. This is proper academic work. This is what Max Horkheimer called traditional theory, right? Making the case that it is impossible to produce left work from the academy, that would be silly. You can produce left work from the academy. There's a million lists. Some of the people in the room I would even cite as doing that. However, even for the most part scholastic work, there is nothing particularly wrong with it. It's fine. But there are a series of dilemmas posed by the new scholasticism for left work broadly writ. A, the incentives of the academy, both historically and increasingly in recent years, and those of social movements are grossly misaligned. Skipping. B, the branding function, especially within those disciplines and fields that do view themselves as deeply socially engaged, have particularly adverse outcomes. First, a radical, quote, brand has significant advantages for the university, both as a legitimation function, demonstrating the unreal freedom of the researcher and the audacity potential within its university spaces, and as a marketing opportunity, right? It's attractive for bringing in students and attention. This has two effects, and second, given the social position of the university within the broader social totality, that radicalism must not threaten the university's investment opportunities, which is its primary economic function in society, right? We are talking within a tax-free hedge fund. Second, wait, I don't want to lose all my things.
We have to.
Yeah, I got it. I'm just a list of the 4 things the university does, and then I'll shut it up. It's rent-seeking opportunities here in New York. That's largely its real estate functions. Its gatekeeping functions, right? This is its primary social function. This is so we can make sure that the proper elites are shifted into broader social power. And finally, at the level of governance, with the revolving door exchange between commercial, state, and other institutions for the preservation of private power in society. So I'll just cut off the rest and say, these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about research production, if we think our work is on the left and what is happening in universities. And this is not saying abandon this work or abandon this site, but try to think about it strategically within a system to gain power, as opposed to a constantly self-referential sort of conversation that may have academic but no political interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay. I think the main purpose of my response is going to be to try and offer some examples of what a critical other might be.
Sure.
And then we can talk about them later. There are 3 that I have in mind, and I'm not really asking for, how is what you're talking about relevant to my research context, because only one of those examples is in my area of study. But the first one that is actually immediately called to mind is an example David Harvey mentions himself in Neoliberalism in the City. He talks about how unionized trash collectors started
Yes.
the Fear City campaign, which tried to deter tourists from visiting Manhattan so as to bring New York City's brand down. That was the essential function of that campaign, and the response was to sort of ring-fence Manhattan. Workers from the other boroughs did not get the same kind of settlements, if any, that workers from within Manhattan got. And the conversation that you were thinking about in terms of gatekeeping
Yes.
was something that occurred to me when thinking about that. So in that sense, I'm sort of trying to, as I think you had said earlier, trying to widen the scope of your analysis actually outside of the university.
Absolutely.
And to think about, so that we can start to think about the ways in which the two are connected, the kind of the governance structure more broadly and what the university itself is doing. And I don't know if you mentioned it in this version, but you had been talking about the idea of defensive replication, the idea that faculty defensively are trying to ensure that their research remains relevant so that it's replicated in their students and replicated in future professions. And I agree, but I'm wondering about the extent to which this is defensive when we shift it to other contexts, and whether we can actually think of it as at other occasions aggressive or co-opting. It is true that they're defending themselves from certain administrators or having their budgets cut. And the main example that occurred to me, which occurs in my own research, was the foundation of the Workers' Educational Association in Britain. It was founded in 1903, and it was a adult education association aimed, often it was Oxbridge tutors. Very famous speakers such as H.G. Wells and Virginia Woolf went to speak to those often quite large classes of working class people who had decided to go to become more educated so that they could advocate for their own cause. And I have a quote here from Jonathan Rose's The Intellectual Life of the British Working Class. At the grassroots level, the WA created an articulate and obstreperous working class intelligentsia. The adult student tackles the town library committee for banning Shaw's Black Girl, challenges the local clergy to show more social zeal, tells the mill owners what is wrong with their policy, ventilates the local lack of facilities for cultural education. And one of the sort of ambivalent issues in the writing of the Workers' Educational Association is the extent to which it is a radicalizing or moderating organization, and specifically whether or not it is simply a projection of elites to imagine a working class aristocracy, a term more used in the 19th century but still present in the 1930s. So at the end of at the end of these kind of summer classes, the question was put to them: had their political views changed by the end of the class? These organizers were often confronted by early right-wing economics tutors or tutors in politics and new disciplines that were forming in the 1930s, and a pretty simple question: had their views actually changed? Hardly any students said that they had changed their minds, despite fierce arguments with their tutors. And this is, again, in a context when welfare is already starting to be strict in the 1930s, or there's starting to be more means tests and conditionality about whether or not you get assistance and allowance. Some admitted to changing their temperament, so willing to hesitate more often, but only a very few admitted to actually changing their political view. So in other words, these kinds of outreach, the question that I'm throwing out is that whether or not the extent to which these outreach programs actually will change anyone's mind, which is part of but I'm not saying that necessarily from the point of view of cynicism, because after listening to your response and thinking about it, I remember that for an industry hiring a relatively small number of people, it only needs a few. The Workers' Educational Association was set up with mixed motives, not only to absorb revolution and thereby suppress it. Similar projects by liberals of dignification occurred in Spain and elsewhere. For small hiring pools, it only needs to be a few to be skimmed off and mollified. Both Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn, despite their supposed professed animosities, ran elections with the slogan, "For the many, not the few." But if we had to make a new description for this operation, it might be skimming a new few from the many, or making a new few. As cynical as this reading might be, it also suggests to me that the replication is not only defensive, because the academy is actually under attack, but at times rather aggressive. It might be uncomfortable to pair the aggressions of the neoliberal banks who defended Manhattan and let the other boroughs be with the outreach programs and hiring practices of the modern university. But this is more or less the kind of critique that is already being made of this university. Its forum, the space designed by Renzo Piano as part of its Manhattanville campus, is supposed to be an open space for engagement with the community. Its design, according to a recent architectural reviewer, is not industrial but industrial-ish. The neither this nor that, the pseudo-public space, has been observed as one of the hallmark creations of neoliberalism. Alongside the semi-policed new plazas in London, private land open for public use. These spaces, described by Rem Koolhaas, have been described by Rem Koolhaas as junk space.
Yeah.
In a famous phrase, he says, "Air-conditioned space is conditional space." And the forum for now is mainly red chairs, Apple laptops, and whispers, while the bouldering and climbing gym has been subject of enough satire for me to add anything original here. In conclusion, I'm seeking not only to see this replication as the defensive act of one professional class against the attacks of another professional class, but instead as part of a layered series of classes all engaging attempts to replicate, not only replicate themselves. Classes, of course, do aim to replicate one another, but they also aim to borrow identities from one another. Wealthy people will refer to themselves as lower, middle, or upper within their own strata. George Orwell, who I researched, was quite keen on hyphenating his class position to be a member of the lower, upper middle class. The mental life of class identity, the ways in which we vicariously take on aspects of other classes and project onto classes certain descriptions, such as working class aristocracy, even if that seems an outmoded term now, are in fact part of the larger operations of neoliberalism. Yeah. So that's kind of the overall sort of what I had down. What I'd basically like us to focus on is where the line is in terms of thinking of how the university itself might be otherizing those supposed critical others that you're thinking of, and whether or not somebody like a trade union worker producing a pamphlet for the Fear City campaign counts as a critical other, whether an educational association that's set up with mixed motives, such as the Workers' Educational Association, counts as a critical other. I look forward to talking about that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you to Jane. So the final alum speaker will be Ginger Nolan, who is Assistant Professor of Architectural Theory at the University of Southern California. Her PhD is in Architectural History in affiliation with ICLS. And her work focuses on developments of new techno-aesthetic means of representation and production in the context of a racialized global division of labor. She recently published a short book with the University of Minnesota Press titled The Neocolonialism of the Global Village. And there's another book well underway that is provisionally titled Savage Mind to Savage Machine, Design, Technology, and the Making of Magical Thought. In addition to which, Ginger has published articles in Grey Room, the Journal of Architecture, Architectural Theory Review, and other venues. And the respondent will be an Nepalese Allen-Mossman, who's PhD candidate in Latin American and Iberian cultures and ICLS, and work focuses on the urbanization of the interior in Argentina from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. And I forgot to say that Ginger's remarks will be entitled Doing Operative Humanities. Oh no, change?
Yeah, don't worry about it.
You tell them that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have a bit of laryngitis. So thank you to the organizers, moderators. ICLS has always been a kind of disciplinary home away from home, so it's nice to be back home. So I was asked, I think, to discuss changes in pedagogy since I graduated from the PhD program. So having only been out for about 3 years and being a bit of a historian, I cannot talk about things that are only 3-year duration, so I'll be talking about some changes in pedagogy that I think have been in the offing for the past decade or two. And specifically two kind of contradictory but mutually reinforcing tendencies that have gained a lot of currency recently. And the first I'm just going to sort of schematize as teaching as a form of policing student behavior. And second is teaching as a consumer product. And Patrick agrees with me.
I'll try to react to
this
things.
illustration here is just to show that how intramural pedagogy, the things I'm talking about, these tendencies are linked to the university's extramural activities of policing and transforming the university into a site of consumption. This is a school I teach at now, and a colleague who will also recognize some things from the next slide. Exhibit A on pedagogy as policing, which are the things I'm required to put in my syllabi. So I don't know if you can read the kind of headings of this at least, but I've truncated this, we have to include a whole page on sort of health and support services that are available to students, as well as, of course, like most universities having to have many kind of descriptions about the punitive, protocols for academic dishonesty and explanations of the grading scale, which I actually kind of removed illegally from mine. And we have to have a policy on technology in the classroom. So on students using devices and things like that. So for the student reading the syllabus, they don't read the syllabus, but if they did, pedagogy is basically presented as an object of litigation and kind of defense against litigation, as a device of parenting, I think in a kind of pastoral way, as well as more conventionally disciplinary ways. And of course, it's a form of policing with the excessive emphasis on academic dishonesty. So right at the kind of heart of pedagogy, pedagogy is basically established in the syllabus as a form of distrust. And these things were not, in syllabi when I was undergraduate. So, and this expansion of distrust, I see it especially evident in a device of teaching that has become absolutely standard, I feel like, in the past 10 to 20 years. It also did not exist when I was an undergraduate, which is the required reading response, which some of you may not implement, but it's something that almost all my colleagues implement. And it has certainly some intellectual usefulness to it, but it is basically a way of policing students' reading. And I think it teaches students that reading is something that they must be coerced into doing. Instead of using reading discussion as a way to inculcate in them the desire to read difficult texts and show them that it can be done. So this brings me to my third point, moving now from pedagogy as policing to pedagogy as a kind of product, which is related to what I see as the kind of importance of reading discussion and the ways it's being challenged by a recent tendency to demand constant pedagogic innovation in a kind of corporate language. And I think some more senior faculty might not even be necessarily aware of these changes, because these are things now that people applying to jobs and people submitting tenure dossiers, we are asked to submit an explanation of how we use technology innovatively in the classroom, right? This isn't our requirement. This is something that one gets hired or not hired on the basis of. And I certainly think that there's been a kind of increasing scrutiny of teaching methods, which is not without its benefits. I mean, it can be certainly very useful to reflect on one's kind of pedagogic methods and think of experimenting with those methods. At the same time, I think the scrutiny that comes sort of at the conjuncture of a rising use of digital technologies in the classroom and a kind of glut of underemployed PhDs is like performing something kind of particular. And the university administrators, I think, are often getting at a very particular idea of teaching innovation, which not only kind of assumes that technology and innovation are self-evident goods, but it insists that knowledge be made concrete and, that it be made concise and transparent. Mm-hmm. This is like a rhetoric that I just heard suddenly, overwhelmingly in the past 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. And I've been asked at several institutions, including Pratt, where I am now, other places, that to make sure that all my lectures and seminars have clear takeaways, and often in the form of bullet points. So lecturers have to have bullet point lists of what students are learning. And I think this is so that students can sort of see the product they're consuming to some extent. And I also think it has to do with something that is the very particular way in which the university is invoking what they call diversity. Because diversity is often used as the justification for why teaching methods have to be reflected on. And I think that is, in some ways, laudable, and depending on how one interprets it. But I think when that is coupled in the context of the kind of this concomitant demand that we be making everything concise and transparent and translated into bullet points, what they mean by diversity is not, encouraging a kind of multivocal discourse, right? What they're talking about is eliding differences in languages So that's students who are accepted because they pay full tuition. And I sort of think of these students as the ones who pay the most, or the ones who speak the least often, because they are accepted, and this is especially true in architecture schools, which I teach, which have often lower TOEFL standards. They're accepted for their tuition dollars and not having the English proficiency often to succeed academically in the institutions. So I feel like in that context, the sort of micro scrutiny of pedagogical methods, the insistence on using technology innovatively, the insistence on making things clear and concise, really has to do with a kind of vision of diversity that is almost anti-diverse, because it's not about polyvalent voices, but it's really about using technology and bullet points and such things to alive linguistic differences. And there's a very, very specific version of diversity that's being talked about. So if I have 1 minute, I'm just, in the spirit of pedagogical innovation, being the hypocrite that I am, I'm just going to showing one exercise that I assign in the context of a lecture with 120 students that is it's about architectural theory, so it's about reading, but there's no discussion sections. And so how do I do this without doing the policing device of a weekly reading response? How do I kind of engage students in close reading? And so I decided to match students. So I did this thing called reading partners, where you match students of kind of differing disciplinary backgrounds and perhaps linguistic backgrounds, and have them do the readings together and make sure that they're kind of explaining things to each other and discussing them and actually recording that discussion itself about different interpretations and things like that. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Okay, hello. As you know, my name is Ana Iglesias, and I'm a graduate student here. First, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you, Ginger, for your presentation. I'd also like to thank ICLS for providing us this opportunity. And I'd also like to apologize to Sarah Monks and Kelly Lemons for being the most unruly of fellows in academic administration, but also for your work in making the symposium possible, and to the other participants for your very interesting remarks. And lastly, I'd like to thank Kathleen Evinson, who was supposed to be in my place today, but who could not make it. So in place of some formal remarks, I have some questions. So first I'll summarize, and then I guess I'll get to the question. So the kind of dynamic that I think that you seem to be tracing is kind of individualization of responsibility happening simultaneously with the university's kind of growing resistance to measures of accountability. So perhaps demands coming from within the student body, faculty, and community get transferred into these kinds of disciplinary measures. The other thing that I think is interesting about your particular talk is this use of the word policing. Also in a space of kind of interdisciplinary thought. This is something that I was thinking about a lot when I was putting together this presentation. What is your talk doing in an interdisciplinary space? And I think there's a distinction to be made here between policing, discipline, and interdisciplinarity in the kind of way that ICLS practices it. And the first point that I'd like to make, or the first question that I'd like to ask is what does policing do as a metaphor for discipline in an interdisciplinary or an interdisciplinarizing university? We know that the university's expansion, gentrification, and kind of interest in making the community more docile consumers of its product, that there's some kind of connection here. But I think that policing is a very particular form of discipline. And it's a sufficient enough reality for people on campus, for Black and brown students on campus, for workers on campus, that to conflate policing with discipline in the classroom or disciplinary measures in the classroom. I'm not sure what that does then. The other point that I've been thinking about a lot over the past couple weeks in preparing this presentation is the role of ICLS as a collective body dedicated to shared work. This has come up a lot in the conversations that we've had over the past day and two. This team teaching thing. And I wonder what the role of ICLS in this kind of gentrifying university can be. If the university is pushing us to take on these responsibilities as individuals, what is the project of ICLS in this climate? And what will our role in ICLS be in the coming years? Yeah, I think these are interesting reflections to be made in the space provided by ICLS, a group of scholars that made interdisciplinary thinking an institution on campus in the wake of the Area Studies project. And I think that your reflections are interesting because the parallel developments you discuss also take place at a time when it seems like everyone is trying to do the interdisciplinary thing. And I really liked what you said, AJ, earlier about the idea of emancipation at the university. My suspicion is that one of the ways that interdisciplinary is being co-opted by the university is as the idea that we can be emancipated from all of the shady things that the university is doing around us. And I think that at ICLS we're suspicious of that attempt, but I don't know how we are trying to forestall this co-optation. So those are my questions. Sorry for them being so scattered. But I'm really excited to hear what everyone says in the question and answer period.
Can I just ask, how much time do we have?
So the session as a whole is an hour and 15 minutes.
Which means we have 10 minutes.
Maybe, but
So, I mean, it seems to me that really great questions have been thrown out by all of the respondents, and the best thing to do is to start by maybe asking the alums to respond to one of the questions that's been presented, so that we can get to hear from everybody again and develop that a bit, and then hopefully we can open it up as well. Do you want to start then?
Okay. Is this one working? Is that okay? Can you hear? Wait. Take it out. Hello. Is that good? Okay. Now, first of all, thank you for those incredibly searching questions. I wish we had like another day to talk about all of this, and this should be part of an ongoing discussion, really. I don't know which one to respond to because they're all extremely important. I think I want to respond to the one where you ask about teaching and languages, and is it just a whole load of languages that we're learning and so on? No, I don't think so. I think why that's important is because we're not learning languages as an end in themselves, but because that's the thing that enables you to become an active interlocutor with your interlocutor. And if you become an active interlocutor with your interlocutor, then something, to borrow a word that somebody said yesterday, something incalculable might happen. And it means, okay, you asked a lot of questions about measurement and metrics and so on, right? I think it means that we're put in the position of having to suspend our own metrics. So, in the sense of many of the things that you asked about, I have to say, I don't know. This is an ongoing experiment, and I think that what's magical about ICLS is that it provides the space for that. I could speak to many of the other questions, but I would like to let other people speak as well here. So who's next? AJ.
Guess it's me. Thanks, man. We cool? All right, just one. Okay. First of all, thanks. This is like all the great questions. And it also there's like all the things I didn't get a chance to talk about. So to sort of boil this down, it's a three-parter if I just use one of your questions. But like the antecedents thing, right? It's so good, right? The example you're giving of the workers' education work in early 20th century Britain. There are of course other parallels, right? At that same time in Russia, there was the proletarian universities and things of that nature. And I think that these kinds of others we can really be thinking about, and those were of course wholly detached from the formal university. The question about political, this is the sort of second part of that, which is a political education, right? That at the end of that question, you were saying, what did people get out of it? I have no idea. That particular program sounds like it was probably poorly designed. And I actually think it's a conversation I have a lot with political party workers, with labor workers, labor or organizers who think that political education is this dumbass ideological education, whereas in fact it is giving people the space to move. And then finally, the last thing, you mentioned the sort of like blurring of Corbyn and Blair. When I'm in like hardcore left spaces, I'm the person like pushing the like milquetoast social democrats to all become communists. But when I'm in a space like this, I want to say that like pointing out like eliding Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn is the least politically threatening thing anyone can do. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm saying this is heavily incentivized. This kind of, it's not real anarchism. It's kind of like a facile, lazy, fun, sexy, branded anarchism that threatens no one. And that is heavily incentivized in the university.
So thank you for raising those questions. I think I'm glad you pointed this out. I was actually, when I thought I had more time than I did, going to include just a newspaper clipping from the woman Yale, who was recently asked to leave the dormitories. She was a student because she was black. Because I think that disciplining and policing shouldn't be conflated. You're right, but they do affect students differently,
Yes.
right? And so, I mean, the case in point being the way that sort of the growing awareness of sexual assault and sexual politics on campus has really disproportionately victimized, but disproportionately affected black men. And so there's definitely ways in which, and there's also the fact that many of the kind of issues I'm talking about of kind of treating the student as a kind of miscreant before the fact is coupled with the fact that many of those students are also kind of above the law, when it comes to things like plagiarism and whatnot. So there's this constant kind of talk about punitiveness that actually never really plays out, it seems. And that's true, I think. So, but I would guess that those kind of structures of punishment and disciplining affect different students differently, So I think that's perhaps what you're pointing towards, maybe, if I understood you correctly, yeah. And I think to talk about it more generally, I mean, because in some cases, clearly people who are presumed sort of prima facie to be criminals, right, might be treated as such, whereas other students, I think some of this sort of disciplinary approach to education is really just kind of promoting a kind of irresponsibility and immaturity, right? And they're being taught that they can get away with it ultimately, no matter how much they're warned against it. So I think that there's different things that are being produced among different students, all of which are problematic. But yeah.
So I guess if we have a couple more minutes, maybe questions from the floor, if anyone would like to build on any of those questions or react strongly or not.
I maybe wanted to ask something coming out of Ginger's talk, actually. At some point you talked about policing and the way in which reading responses lead students into doing the work. And you mentioned very quickly at that point the word desire as the opposite to that. So how could we make students want to read rather than lead them into reading? And that kind of led me back to what Ajay and his respondent were talking about before, when we were talking about politics. And I was thinking, would you want to ask your students at the end of your course, how have your political views changed as a result of this class? Probably you wouldn't, right? That's the non-ideological work you're talking about. So I kept thinking about this, split act phrase, what is pedagogy? It's the uncoercive rearrangement, not of your political views, but of desire, right? So it takes us straight back into something that's probably more closely related to language learning, to the ethical symbiosis that we were talking about yesterday. Something that precedes maybe the political position, and when we're teaching comparatively, also when we're thinking about the assignments that we're making for our students, we're probably working more at the level of desire than at the level of leftist knowledge, emancipation, whatever you want to call that. So I was wondering if people had any thought about that. I'm not saying working on desire is not related to that, but it seems to put a different sort of spin on the project.
You're first, right?
Yeah. So you're asking me about desire, is that right? Like,
Indeed,
yeah. So I mean, that's an interesting question because, like, I think that the cultivation of desire and desires to read and reread and read carefully, like, and I can think about my own experience as a student, like as an undergraduate, and how there's an aesthetic, right? And there's a charisma to teaching which can be abused. And it's hard to say at what point the abuse is sort of non-abuse, because I think they're very close to each other. But I do think that cultivation of that desire has to do with, like, it is a kind of aesthetic act. Sorry, I can't talk. Does that make sense? Like, in that, I think there's always, in the same way that, like, that one's interest in the text is often there's an aesthetic element to that, right? Into the kind of a certain kind of desire for things to be kind of like there's an implotting, right? And kind of how things are kind of revealed, and you're disabused of certain things, and there's these kind of movements. And I think that doing that, kind of reproducing that in class, is a way to maybe like I guess cultivate a certain desire to be disabused of certain notions, right? Which students might resist. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah. So thanks. This is both actually in response to this question and in thinking about some of what this conversation between Ginger and Annalisa. Thank you. Because this question of when I was listening to this exchange and thinking about what you both were presenting, I was thinking, like, frankly, in our own work, it's incredibly liberating to have no punitive power over your students whatsoever. I have no punitive power over my students whatsoever. They can come, they can go. There's all kinds of structures in there. I'm happy to talk about it later. It doesn't matter. But what this does is it does mean, there is a self-selection process, all kind of stuff. But what it does mean is that the potential for the cultivation of two things together in response to this direct question are possible. One, sociality. People are doing it together. And two, desire. That they're doing it because they feel it's an affective response, because it feels good. It feels like a collective effort. And we learn to do collectivities through feeling them. And actually, to me, that's a tremendously, I think, look, I teach like a lot, like some really gnarly, weird stuff and some really classic stuff. I teach like intro Marx and things like that. But when I teach intro Marx, I'm just as interested in that cultivation of a kind of desire for that space of sociality, as I am in then understanding what the fuck a commodity is, or the circuit of capital. And I think there are other spaces, it's a good, ICLS conference is a good place to bring up sort of like things we wouldn't normally think about, right? So like last night someone was asking about some of my older research, and I was thinking of an institution like the Husseiniya Irshad in pre-revolutionary Iran, right? It's a space, right? I'm not saying this is a good or a bad, right? There's no such thing as a riskless politics, but it's a place that people wanted to be. It is not a place people had to be. In fact, they had to carve out time to be there. But it was an incredibly powerful learning space and an incredibly powerful political space. I have more I could say here, but I'll cut it off.
My question
Actually, I think if I could just, I think Ben also wanted to.
I wanted to respond to that last question. I'm sorry to cut you off. I won't take up too much time. I just wanted to say that yes, I agree. Teaching and learning is actually constitutively a bit dangerous precisely because it gets close to the desiring parts of the subject, and so it inevitably involves all sorts of transference and counter-transference kind of things. Yeah. Humanities is particularly weird because it kind of studies those dynamics as well. So we're sort of acting out what we study to some extent. We deal closely with that. I have questions about this in the sense of, well, is discipline necessarily coercion? Both Kant and Gramsci in their writings on education write precisely about how difficult it is to construct the attention of the child, right? They have to sit on these hard wooden chairs. They have to write exercises over and over again and those kinds of things. Those to me are open questions about, okay, at what level do we think that disciplinarity is non-coercive and in fact is the way of opening up the child rather than thinking that, they're just being coerced into something. These are all very open questions, but I just wanted to add that.
Great.
Sorry, can you relaunch your question?
Yes, thank you. My question is about the relation between interdisciplinarity and labor. So as I mentioned a few times, there is a kind of active graduate worker union in the university. So a lot of these questions are being posed in very practical and theoretical ways. The standard university in the United States divides its the people who are learning and teaching into kind of paid, sort of unpaid, and then paying kind of groups, right? Undergraduate, yes. Graduate, and
precisely.
And I guess my question, and intermediate grades too. Much is made out of ICLS's particular commitments to, on the one hand, seminar style, and on the other hand, team teaching. And I'm kind of interested in hearing, in particular, I think, with respondents, about what happens to labor or work, say, in an institutional context that privileges team teaching and the seminar. Two specific points in terms of the seminar. My question is really, one idea of the seminar is that in the context in which the teacher learns as well, right? In that case, why should some people be paid and some not, right? That was kind of the question, right? The other thing is about team teaching, right? Team teaching, because it has to happen within the, and you should object to me if you disagree with that, but in team teaching is difficult in universities because universities feel that it is doing half the work, right? And so you have to do this kind of, you have to find ways to piece together the teaching units and so on. Often this means reliance on adjunct labor, right? So you get two faculties who work together to teach a course, but that empty space has to be filled by adjunct labor. So these are the two questions I had.
Can I piggyback on that question? It's a different question, but just because of the question of labor.
We're being shown the 0 seconds.
Okay. I'll
stop sign.
We're at 0 seconds. I can't ask the question.
Otherwise, I'm going to stop. Maybe we could, very quick.
Yeah, they're supposed to respond.
Oh, I'm a bit unsure, especially in the view of Anu and Staphis together, who were my team teachers for Intro to ICLS.
Please say it.
I think that, I don't know necessarily, I'm not certain about the kind of pertinence of labor to this question. It's more, I think that previous question about desire and kind of counter-transferential phenomena is probably probably kind of a better, more sort of pertinent way of getting at what is distinctive about that dynamic. I'm not certain how the team teaching changes it. But maybe it sort of like breaks a kind of cleavage within the master or whatever, right? Like you're not addressing a unity, but like more. I suppose it takes some of the pressure off in a way. You can play one against the other, as I did with you two.
And I would just quickly add that one of the difficulties in running seminars and in running discussion groups is that the students are supposed to be the ones who are doing the talking, right? That's supposed to be the major pedagogical innovation. But in my experience, it sometimes has been that in classes where there are two professors, I've picked up a lot, right? Like, which is not surprising. But I've been in philosophy classes where often two professors have been talking to each other, and there's an acceleration, right? You know, suddenly you're learning about discourse. Just as when we read essays, there are critics talking to each other. You're seeing the same thing happening in person. So that's another, issue about those two different kind of motives. I know it doesn't directly address the question about labor, but
That's failed.
I'm just going to address the first part of the question. About labor and interdisciplinarity. Through my involvement in Graduate Workers of Columbia, I have to say that for all of the kind of overblown discourse here about, STEM and humanities work and interdisciplinarity, the most integrated spaces that I've been in have actually been union spaces. The kinds of conversations that we have often have to do with pedagogy. And considering the kind of lack of teacher training that I have experienced here at Columbia, I think it's really interesting that the union offers a kind of maybe oblique way of getting really great on-the-ground training about how to talk to your students about what it means to take collective action, how the final paper actually fits in with the rest of the course, why we have these assignments. And oftentimes we realize that the assignments that we give don't actually have the effect that we think that they do. But moreover, I think that my last point in my response to Ginger had a lot to do with thinking about what an institute does that is different from a different kind of collective body on campus. And what the legacy of ICLS as kind of post-area studies, also flight from the disciplines, means in concert with the particular issues that the union is trying to address via collective action. Those aren't definitive answers, but.
Great, thank you so much. This has been really tremendous, very challenging, very thought-provoking. Thank you to everybody.